Welcome back to Radio Entrepreneurs. I'm Jonathan Friedman, joined by Walter Sullivan for our episode on In the Weeds. Walter, a great morning thus far, and our next guest up is Brad Krevor, who is president of Responsible Retailing Forum. Welcome to Radio Entrepreneurs and In the Weeds.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your organization and what it is that you do, some important work.
Responsible Retailing Forum began as a project at Brandeis University, where I was a researcher. Pardon me, I went to Brown first. It was an effort to bring together all the key stakeholders in the alcohol and the tobacco industry, both the people who sell it and produce it, the people who consume it, and in particular, the people in public health and prevention who are concerned about the implications of excessive use, or in the case of tobacco, any use, and to try to create some sort of rapprochement to get real discussions going about how all these different stakeholders, public and private, can work together to ensure that the people who are selling and serving these age-restricted products do so legally, they achieve high compliance, but they also build it into their business model. That responsibility is something that consumers respect.
And I think by bringing all the different entities together as a partnership is a much better approach.
And it's a challenging one because
very
typically the person who sells or serves alcohol hears from the industry people, like the angel on one shoulder, that these are the products and this is how to promote them. And on the other shoulder, you have the people in public health and prevention saying, don't sell so much, don't sell to minors, don't sell to this. So it's like almost competing voices.
Split personality, you have to listen to both sides and come down to the middle.
And as you know, I ran the Alcoholic Beverages Control Commission, and we brought all the industry together, both Mothers Against Drunk Driving, public health, and so forth. And really, people will focus 80% of the things they'll agree on. 20% they won't, but they focus 100% on the 20%. By being able to bring the groups together and you got to get out, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, against liquor stores and so forth, but they all have the same common denominator. They care about their children, they care about access to alcohol only to people 21 or older, and making sure they don't serve intoxicated people, because there's a risk, and plus they have a lot in common relative to being parents.
And we've been very fortunate because, as you say, this is the one issue on which all the different stakeholders agree, no matter how divided they are on other issues.
And I think your approach is not draconian, which gets the industry nervous. It's really about education and forum, making sure people understand the rules, but in a way that's more positive.
We came to recognize, first we were grappling with the question, why is it that a licensee would allow the sale to a minor when all you have to do is check an ID? And if you don't check an ID, not only you're fined, but you can lose your whole license. It was just made no sense at all. What we came to realize when we studied this with large national chains is that the greatest challenge is just lack of attention. That retailing is very repetitive work. You bag and swipe, or if you're at a bar, you might be serving 20, 30 customers at the same time. You just lose your focus. And so what we've done is try to develop ways to keep the focus.
Well, I think that's exactly right, is that repetitiveness makes a difference. I mean, you'll see some industries, some parts of the industry say, anyone that looks 40 or under, we're going to cut. Or we're going to cut everyone. You go to a Red Sox game. Their approach is repetitiveness. Everyone gets carded. Now, it doesn't matter if it's your ID or not. They're going to get carded.
Well, it's really fascinating because it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Repetition leads to compliance, but by the same token, repetition potentially leads to burnout in some respect, right?
Everyone who's concerned with these issues are concerned because of the public health and safety ramifications. But the solutions lie in the domain of industrial health. I mean, a sale to a minor occurs for the same reason as an industrial accident. You knew what you were supposed to do, but you just lost attention.
And that's exactly right. And I think it's really, in trying to convince them, it doesn't really take that much time. You're not really losing any seals. It's a real simple question to ask. Can you show me your ID?
And not only does it take very little time, but we did some studies to show that adult customers said overwhelmingly they didn't mind waiting in line a little bit longer while the clerk checked that ID for the kid in front of them.
And the same principle probably applies to airline travel. I don't mind waiting in line as long as you can offer me some assurance that that the plane's going to be safe.
Yes, but also those customers are also parents.
Right. And I like to think they ask me for my ID because I look so young.
So, Brad, we're featuring today in the weeds, and there's some applicability in terms of what you're doing in the alcohol industry, also with newly emerging legal markets for adult use marijuana. So, tell us a little bit about some of the work that you're doing in that area as well.
Well, first to say I'm surprised we have the opportunity to do this work, because 20 years ago when we started the Responsible Retailing Forum, we never thought that marijuana would be part of the discussion. In fact, we stayed away from the issue because we thought all the alcohol and tobacco stakeholders would be so scared they'd abandon the Responsible Retailing Forum. As it turns out, it's been a very different course of events. But marijuana is an age-restricted product. The challenges in being sure that it's not being sold to people who are underage are the same as those for alcohol and tobacco. So it's now part of the work we do.
And I think you find, all the guests we've had on today on the ancillary businesses are people that are already in a certain business. The business you're in, highly regulated industries, both alcohol and tobacco, very transferable over to the cannabis industry, can offer the same benefits, have an incredible value to the industry that I think makes a difference and reduce risks to licenses. Because if you sell to a minor, your license could be gone.
Yeah.
And it's also a public health issue as well.
And what applies to alcohol, of course, applies to marijuana as well. And as a state regulator in Utah once said at the beginning of a conference we were holding, he said the good news is last year in Utah we sold 20% more alcohol. The bad news is last year in Utah we sold 20% more alcohol. So there's an economic drive to be more successful, to sell more. There's a public health concern that the more you consume, the greater the risks.
How do you go about getting your clients?
We've worked largely with the regulators. We are called the Responsible Retailing Forum. Our actual research and field services are at the level of the retailer, but the people who sponsor this are state regulators, they're brewers and distillers. It's the
industry.
major stakeholders, yes. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think one of the things we always brought up when I was running the ABCC is that all the accidents you see is potentially a Budweiser can floating in the car, and the kids are underage. I apologize for using Budweiser, but it's the most marketable brand that people know about in the sense of that's the problem, that's what they see. And I think the same thing is true with cannabis, is that all of a sudden you're going to find an accident happens. Oh, well, we smelled marijuana. The kids are underage. The industry has to get ahead of it. We saw what happened in the alcohol industry. The cannabis industry has to get ahead of themselves.
I agree with you completely, but I don't really understand, and I don't think most people understand, what is this industry? Who are they? I mean, you mentioned Budweiser, you mentioned Coors when we were talking before. Everyone knows the major brewers, the major distillers. And Budweiser doesn't sell to a minor. Budweiser can't sell to a consumer. They can only sell to distributors. The same thing with distillers. But when a young person is drinking and you see it's a can of Bud or it's a Jack Daniels, they associate the problem with the producer. In marijuana, we're just trying to figure that out.
And I think that's a really good point, is that why a cultivator or a production licensee should care about what the retailer does. Because it's not going to be about ABC retailer, it's going to be about their brand name that's going to come into play.
And when there's lax performance, when there's non-compliance, and the public sector responds to the danger that represents, their regulations paint a very large, broad brush, and it affects everyone. So people who are good actors but tolerate poor actors wind up getting stained the same way.
And I would imagine within the cannabis industry, there's this other driving factor of edibles, which process in the system much differently, and somebody may not think that they're impaired, so to speak, but half an hour later, they're significantly impaired.
The consumer himself is the most interesting part of this sort of equation with cannabis. If we're talking about training someone to serve alcohol, well, it's checking IDs and monitoring consumption, but it's mostly knowing what are you serving and how do you make the drinks. But here we have people who are going to legal dispensaries. They may have smoked marijuana over the years when it was illegal, but there are no well-known brands. There's no,
consistency.
You don't know what you're
board,
getting.
right.
And so right now, one of the big differences, I think, in retailing of marijuana is just the education of their own consumers.
And I think you find it's not your father's marijuana. I have a friend that is
We'll call him Bob.
Bob that decided a couple of years ago, trying to relive his life from the 70s, 80s. His nickname was Maggot in college, so that might help you out. But he went out and told his wife, she's away for the summer. I'm going to have some friends over, but my friend got some cannabis. We're going to have some cannabis. And he took 2 hits, thought he was having a heart attack. It wasn't the same that he smoked before.
Right.
And I think education is so important in understanding the products, whether it's alcohol, whether it's tobacco, whether it's cannabis. Understanding the product, what it can do, but also how to deal with the problems of overindulgence, ensure that it doesn't get into minors' hands. And that is everybody's responsibility.
As someone with a background in alcohol regulation, you appreciate that one of the things Americans take for granted is the safety of what they're consuming. And just in the past couple of weeks, we've heard about deaths from tainted alcohol in the Dominican Republic. This happens in Africa and Europe all the time. Well, similarly, people have been smoking marijuana for a long time. No one's ever asked when they bought, whatever quantity they were buying, what kinds of pesticides were used when this was being grown, or how has this been adulterated or touched? It's just no knowledge of the product.
I'm a former prosecutor in narcotics and organized crime, and one of the things you find is the importance of creating a regulated industry. You can't overdose and die from smoking cannabis. However, if the product is tainted in such a mechanism, you can't. And it's important to highly regulate. It's also in the black market, you don't know what they're mixing with it, because you can mix other types of drugs in it in order to increase your client base to buy something that's cheaper but more expensive. And it's so important to regulate it appropriately and to ensure the product is safe.
And similarly, there's a lot of concern, and it's very, very valid, that the ubiquitous availability of marijuana when it's legal is going to lead to an uptake and an excessive consumption. That's certainly true, but there are a number of college football stadia right now over the past couple of years which have introduced or reintroduced drinking in the stands. And that would seem to be, the worst possible thing you could do. But in reintroducing drinking, they were also implementing effective training, supervision, enforcement, and it turns out there are some of these major college football stadia where they've introduced drinking and the incidence of alcohol problems has fallen dramatically.
And that's exactly right.
Can that happen with marijuana? That's an important question.
I do gaming as well, in that the whole idea of controlling, deal with the social costs. Revenue should be the last thing that state, community should care about. It's all about control, making sure the social costs are covered. And by allowing stadiums to control, you reduce the risk. It sounds counterintuitive, but it actually is
Well,
true.
it makes a lot of sense. It probably drops the amount of binge drinking that goes on, right? If I have 2 hours before game time to drink versus a 4-hour spread, I'm more likely to binge, right? Because I can't bring it into the stadium.
That's exactly right.
So it's it's counterintuitive, but it makes a lot of sense when you stop to think about it.
So how, as your entities, as your company's moving into the cannabis industry, how do you see it going forward?
Well, we're still trying to figure out what are the major concerns of the Massachusetts communities themselves. We have found over the years that there has been a great deal of laxity in checking IDs or monitoring consumption as far as alcohol goes. From what I've seen of the legal dispensaries of marijuana here in Massachusetts, the checks and controls to be sure that minors are not purchasing are very, very significant. So I don't know that we're going to see the same, frequency of sales to minors in these legal dispensaries that we've seen with alcohol and tobacco.
That's actually interesting in the sense of one thing, for purposes of medical, you can't get in unless you have a valid ID, and it goes through the state system. So you only can purchase 60 days supply. In all the other dispensaries, no. On the retail side for rec, is that there's no database, and part of the reason is that people don't want to be looked at by Big Brother. So you're only allowed to have an ounce on you, but you could go to one one store, buy an ounce, and walk into another store and buy another ounce and have 2 ounces on you.
When I was a kid, I worked in a drugstore, and people used to come in and buy terpene hydrate and codeine. And they'd go to 3 different drugstores every night, and they'd go from
get their
community
allocation.
yeah.
No, it's fascinating, but I think to your point, Brad, you can walk into a liquor store and they'll check your ID, but they're not running it against anything. And I didn't realize this. In recreational dispensaries in Massachusetts, there's no logging of your information. In Colorado, they do take your ID and log.
Well, there's no state requirement. Now,
Okay.
the question is, like, you'll walk into a liquor store today. There's no state requirement that they keep the information, but a lot of the systems now, that because of the whole issue of the risk of serving an underage person, the store is maybe keeping that information.
Okay.
So if the ABCC comes in saying, look, we just found this person out here. They said they purchased, they didn't have an ID. Well, yeah,
Right.
I'm gonna show you what they produced.
provided.
And so it's really developing risk factors to reduce your risk. Now, I don't know how that plays out in the industry.
But other potential implications, because the technology you're describing, and I used to do a lot of research with these electronic ID scanning technologies, which I thought at the time would be game changers. Turns out they're only as effective as the people who are operating them.
You can go online right now and buy
IDs
3
that are
IDs
compliant.
that will meet the requirements. Now, granted, the way they say that a Massachusetts ID you can bend and it won't break, but these other IDs, if you bend them, they do. That's how some businesses do it. But the approach is whatever, you can't develop anything that someone can't find a way around, but you do the best way possible to deal with it.
Good stuff. Brad, before we wrap up, you mentioned that development of a new product for the cannabis industry, or?
Right. It's very interesting. It's something called Check Yourself, and it's derived from a very innovative product developed by a recently retired UMass Boston psychology professor. With driving under the influence, law enforcement has breathalyzers that can be used. There are lots of problems with breathalyzers and the calibration and the accuracy, but that's a tool for law enforcement. But it's of no value in determining whether a person is also impaired by cannabis. So we're working with Dr. Milburn to develop Check Yourself as a simple app that can be taken on your mobile device or the device provided by the establishment you're visiting. And it's a 1-minute app which will determine if you have the physical and cognitive skills to be able to get home safely. And it's not measuring whether there's a product or substance in your body like alcohol or THC. It's looking at the functional dimension. And you could be impaired by a combination of
Right.
alcohol, cannabis, other drugs. It could just be fatigue.
Right.
But it's something that can be used by both the establishment to protect its customers and by the customers themselves to put it on their own mobile devices to be sure that when they do consume whatever it is they're consuming, they're not a threat to themselves and others.
That's an incredible app.
Yeah, incredible and fascinating too, because to your point, to people at point 08 is not the same in everybody, right? I mean, their functional ability at point 08 from one person to the next, the concentration might be the same, but their functional ability may be very different.
Years ago, I had hoped to develop research projects on breathalyzers, hoping that this would be a way to really protect licensed establishments and customers. And my research colleagues reminded me that if we introduce breathalyzers, and it's particularly in places where young people are drinking, that it becomes instead a competition to see how high you can blow, which kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? But with Check Yourself, no, you can't defeat it. To do better means to be more functional.
Right.
So we're hoping it'll be a well-accepted approach.
Wonderful. Fascinating stuff. Love to hear more about it as it evolves and it gets out into the marketplace. Our guest has been Brad Krevor, president of Responsible Retailing Forum. Brad, if people want to get in touch with you, establishments or other potential clients, distributors, etc., what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
The website is rrforum.org.
Excellent. We are, as I said, our guest, Brad Krevor of Responsible Retailing Forum, and this has been In the Weeds with Walter Sullivan. Walter, it's been a great pleasure.
It's been a pleasure, and it's great having Brad on the show.
Thank you, Walter.
And we look forward to the next time. And you're listening to In the Weeds by Radio Entrepreneurs.